The studio office was plush, designed to intimidate. Thick carpets, mahogany furniture, walls lined with photographs of stars whose careers this man controlled. It was 1942, and Katharine Hepburn had been summoned to discuss her next film contract. She arrived on time, professional, prepared to negotiate terms the way she'd done dozens of times before. What happened in that office would never be officially recorded. No police report, no lawsuit, no mention in any studio memo. But the story spread through Hollywood like wildfire, whispered on sets and in dressing rooms, becoming one of those legendary moments that revealed who Katharine Hepburn really was when someone tried to control her. This is the day Katharine Hepburn slapped a studio executive, and the day he thanked her for it. Understanding this story requires understanding the Hollywood system of the 1940s. Studios didn't just employ actors, they owned them. 7-year contracts were standard, giving studios complete control over careers, images, and personal lives. Studio executives wielded absolute power. They could make stars or destroy them with a phone call, and many of them believed that power extended to the bodies of the actresses who worked for them. Sexual harassment wasn't just common in 1940s Hollywood, it was systematic. Actresses were expected to be friendly with executives, directors, and producers. The casting couch wasn't a myth, it was standard operating procedure. Women who refused often found their careers stalling. Women who complained were blacklisted. Katharine Hepburn had always been different. She'd fought the studio system from the beginning, demanding unusual contract clauses, refusing to play by standard rules. She wore pants. She didn't sign autographs. By 1942, she'd already been declared box office poison and had resurrected her career through sheer force of will with the Philadelphia Story. She was not someone who could be easily controlled, but that didn't stop men from trying. The executive in question was powerful, connected, and used to getting what he wanted. His name has been lost to history, or perhaps deliberately obscured by those who knew the full story. What's known is that he was senior enough to greenlight major productions, wealthy enough to live like royalty, and arrogant enough to believe that Katharine Hepburn would be flattered by his attention. The meeting started normally: contract terms, salary negotiations, discussion of potential projects. Hepburn was there to talk business, and for the first 20 minutes it was business. Then the executive stood up from behind his desk, walked around it, and sat on the edge much closer to Hepburn. She noticed the shift immediately. The conversation changed tone. Comments about the contract became comments about her appearance, how beautiful she looked in certain lighting, how the camera loved her, how certain directors had mentioned enjoying working with her. The subtext was clear, and it wasn't subtle. Hepburn didn't play along. She redirected to business. The executive persisted. He moved closer, mentioned a particular role he could see her in, one that would require close collaboration between them. Said something about dinner, about getting to know each other better, about how careers were built on relationships. Then he put his hand on her knee. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Hepburn stood up abruptly, sending her chair scraping backward. The executive, thinking this was nervousness or perhaps playing hard to get, smiled. He stood as well, reaching for her again. She slapped him, hard, an open-handed strike across the face that made a sound like a gunshot in the quiet office. The executive stumbled backward, more from shock than force, his hand flying to his reddening cheek. For a moment, the room was absolutely silent. The executive stared at Hepburn with an expression that cycled through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been fear. Hepburn stared back, unflinching, her hand still raised slightly as if prepared to strike again. Then she spoke. According to the most reliable versions of the story, passed down through people who heard it from witnesses, her words were devastatingly simple. "Don't you ever touch me again. Not me, not any woman who walks into this office. Do you understand?" The executive's face went from red to white. He was used to being the most powerful person in any room. He was used to women who smiled nervously and left. He was used to control. What he wasn't used to was a woman who hit him and then stood there, daring him to respond. He could have her arrested, he could have her blacklisted, he could destroy her career with a few phone calls. They both knew this, but they also both knew something else. If Katharine Hepburn went public with what had just happened, if she told the press that a studio executive had propositioned her, had touched her without permission, the scandal would ruin him. In 1942, the press still protected Hollywood's powerful, but there were limits. An actress accusing an executive of unwanted advances might be ignored or disbelieved, but Katharine Hepburn, with her reputation for truth-telling, with her connections and her refusal to be intimidated, she could make it stick, and both of them knew it. The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then the executive did something that shocked everyone who later heard the story. He straightened up, composed himself, and said, "You're absolutely right. "I apologize, that was inappropriate." Then, according to the legend that spread through Hollywood, he added, "Thank you. Thank you for slapping him, for stopping him, for drawing a line that apparently no one else had drawn before, or at least not successfully." Hepburn left the office without another word. She didn't get the contract she'd come to negotiate, but she'd accomplished something more important. She'd proven that not every woman in Hollywood could be intimidated, coerced, or controlled. The executive apparently never mentioned the incident again in any official capacity, but his behavior changed. According to women who worked with him in subsequent years, he was notably more professional, more careful. The slap had recalibrated something in him. Word spread quickly through the Hollywood community, though always in whispers. On sets, in commissaries, at parties, the story was told and retold. Katharine Hepburn had slapped a studio executive for inappropriate behavior, and instead of being punished, she'd walked away clean. The reaction from other actresses was fascinating. Some were inspired. If Hepburn could stand up to executive harassment, maybe they could too. Some were terrified, knowing they didn't have Hepburn's power or reputation to protect them. And some were simply amazed that such a thing was possible. Because here's what made Hepburn's response so extraordinary. She didn't just refuse. She didn't just leave. She physically retaliated and made it stick. In an era when women were expected to absorb harassment silently, when fighting back meant career suicide, Hepburn had literally struck back and walked away unscathed. But the privilege inherent in this story is important to acknowledge. Hepburn could do this because she was Katharine Hepburn. She had proven she could resurrect her career. She had her own money. She had connections. She was famous enough that destroying her would create unwanted attention. A contract player, a newcomer, an actress without Hepburn's reputation. They would have been blacklisted, possibly arrested, certainly destroyed professionally. The same response that Hepburn got away with would have ended someone else's career. This uncomfortable truth doesn't diminish what Hepburn did, but it does contextualize it. She was able to set a boundary violently because she had the power to back it up. Most women in Hollywood didn't, and the executive apologized not because he'd had a moral awakening, but because Hepburn was one of the few actresses who could actually hurt him back. The incident became part of Hepburn's mystique. She was the woman who didn't take shit from anyone, not even the most powerful men in Hollywood. But it also served as a reminder of how broken the system was. That it took an act of violence from one of the industry's biggest stars to get an apology for behavior that should never have happened in the first place. Other executives heard the story. Some apparently took it as a warning. Others dismissed it as Hepburn being difficult, eccentric, unable to understand how the business worked. But none of them forgot it. Katharine Hepburn had established herself as someone you couldn't mess with, literally. The slap had consequences beyond the immediate moment. Hepburn's reputation for being difficult intensified. Studio executives were more cautious around her. Some refused to work with her at all, finding her too unpredictable, too willing to cause problems. But others respected the boundary she'd established and treated her with a professionalism they didn't extend to other actresses. Hepburn herself rarely discussed the incident. In an era where she was already selective about what she shared publicly, this episode remained private. She didn't use it for publicity. She didn't write about it in her autobiography. She treated it like what it was, a necessary but unfortunate moment where she'd had to physically defend a boundary that should have been respected automatically. Friends who knew her well said the incident bothered her more than she let on. Not because she regretted slapping the executive, but because she had to. Because the system was so broken that physical violence was her best option for making harassment stop. She would have preferred working in an industry where such responses weren't necessary. But she didn't work in that industry. She worked in 1940s Hollywood, where sexual harassment was endemic, where women's careers depended on male approval, where saying no could mean professional death. In that environment, Hepburn's slap was both revolutionary and deeply sad. The executive continued working in Hollywood for years after the incident. His career didn't suffer. He wasn't fired or demoted. The slap remained a private matter between him and Hepburn, known to others only through gossip. This too reveals something about the power dynamics at play. Even after physically assaulting an executive, even after forcing an apology, Hepburn couldn't actually damage his career. The system protected him, just as it protected all men in his position. The slap created a ripple effect. Other women began refusing inappropriate behavior more forcefully, not with violence necessarily, but with the knowledge that even powerful men could be held accountable if the woman pushing back had enough status. This created a two-tier system. Famous actresses with established careers could demand respect. Everyone else remained vulnerable. The slap didn't reform Hollywood's treatment of women. It just created a small circle of protected individuals who were too valuable to harass with impunity. Decades later, during the Me Too movement, stories like Hepburn's began surfacing more frequently. Women who had physically resisted harassment in old Hollywood, women who had been believed or protected because of their status. These stories were presented as evidence of strength and resistance, which they were, but they also highlighted how little had changed in the fundamental power dynamics that made such resistance necessary. Hepburn lived long enough to see some of these conversations begin. In her 90s, when asked about how women were treated in old Hollywood, she was characteristically blunt. "The system was designed to exploit women," she said. "Some of us fought back. Most couldn't, and we shouldn't have had to fight in the first place." She never specifically mentioned slapping the executive. Even near the end of her life, she maintained discretion about incidents that involved other people by name. But those who knew the story heard the reference clearly. She'd fought back. She'd won, in the immediate sense, but the larger battle remained unresolved. The executive's thank you after being slapped has been interpreted different ways over the years. Some see it as genuine recognition that Hepburn had stopped behavior that could have destroyed him. Others interpret it as a power move, a way of reclaiming control by framing her resistance as something he was allowing. The truth is probably simpler. He thanked her because he was shocked, because he didn't know what else to say, because Hepburn's complete lack of fear had cracked something in his certainty. What remains is the image, Katharine Hepburn, standing in a studio office in 1942, hands still raised from the slap, staring down a man who held enormous power over her career and refusing to blink first. It's a powerful image, an inspiring one, and a deeply troubling reminder of what women had to do simply to be treated with basic respect. The story became one of many that circulated about Hepburn's refusal to tolerate Hollywood's worst behaviors. She was the woman who wore pants when studios demanded dresses, who told gossip columnists to mind their own business, who rebuilt her career on her own terms, and yes, who slapped a man who touched her without permission. Each story added to her legend, but each also revealed the enormous energy women had to expend just to maintain basic autonomy. Energy that male actors never had to waste because their boundaries were automatically respected. When Katharine Hepburn died in 2003, obituaries celebrated her independence, her strength, her refusal to be controlled. The slapping incident was mentioned in some profiles, always with a mix of admiration and humor. Look at how fierce she was. But the humor obscures something darker. A woman shouldn't have to hit someone to stop harassment. The fact that Hepburn did, and that it worked, says less about her strength than about the complete absence of institutional protection for women in Hollywood. The executive who thanked her for the slap remained unnamed in most tellings, protected by the same discretion that kept so many old Hollywood secrets buried. He got to continue his career, maintain his power. He's remembered, if at all, as that guy Katharine Hepburn slapped, rather than as someone who harassed women. That anonymity is its own protection. Hepburn's name is forever attached to this story. His isn't. She's the subject. He's merely context. Even in an incident that was entirely his fault, the historical record centers her response rather than his behavior. And so the story of Katharine Hepburn slapping a studio executive becomes part of Hollywood mythology. A moment of justice in an unjust system, a woman fighting back successfully. It's told as triumph, and in some ways it was. But it was also one woman, one slap, one moment of accountability in an industry built on exploitation. The fact that this incident was remarkable enough to become legendary tells you everything about how rare such moments were. Katharine Hepburn set a boundary violently because that was the only language the system understood. She got away with it because she had the power to make it stick. And an executive thanked her, whether sincerely or sarcastically, because even he understood that she'd crossed a line that most actresses couldn't, and that her willingness to do so made her dangerous in ways that demanded respect. That's the real story. Not just what happened in that office in 1942, but what it revealed about power, privilege, and the price women paid simply to exist in Hollywood on their own terms.